I won for her at auction with my dead wife's ring. I didn't know it then. The bidding had already started when I walked in, and I was already late, and I did not care even a little. The station was called Velhari Crossing, and it sat at the edge of the Dravari belt like a rusted tooth at a stranger's mouth. It smelled like engine oil, recycled air, and something sweet that I could never identify, no matter how many times I came through. 6 months ago, I had made a note in my log to figure out what that smell was. 6 months ago, I still made notes. I still had reasons to be curious. I found a seat near the back of the auction floor and dropped into it the way a man drops into a chair when his body is tired but his mind is worse. The hall was enormous. High ceilings, cold light, rows of alien bidders, packed so close together that their various breathing apparatus and outer membranes pressed against each other in ways I tried not to look at directly. I was the only human in the room. That was not unusual. Humans in the salvage trade were not uncommon out here, but we were rare enough that I got looks, some curious, some cautious, one long, unreadable stare from a Velhari elder near the aisle, whose 4 pale eyes tracked me from the door to my seat without blinking once. I looked away first. My name is Marcus Reyes. I am 34 years old. I have been running a one-man salvage operation in the Outer Belt systems for 11 years. Since I was 23 and stupid and in love and convinced that the galaxy owed me something interesting. The galaxy delivered. Not always in ways I would have chosen, but it delivered. 11 years. And for 3 of those years, Elena had been with me. She had not been a salvager. She was a cartographer, which is a polite word for someone who goes places that have not been mapped yet and draws lines around what they find. She had the kind of mind that saw pattern in chaos, that could look at a new star system and immediately understand its geometry. She understood space the way I understood broken machinery, not as something to fear, but as something to be known. She had come aboard my ship as a contract passenger headed to a survey job near the Dravari, Outer Rings, and she had stayed. Not because of the ship, which was a battered hauler I had named the Caraway for reasons I no longer remembered. Not even because of me, though I liked to think I had something to do with it. She stayed because she looked out the observation window one morning and said the view was better than anything she had ever charted, and she did not want to leave something that beautiful. That was Elena. She stayed for the beautiful things. She died 7 months ago. Not dramatically. Not in some explosion or terrible disaster I could build a story around. A cellular illness that the station medics had caught too late because we had been too far out for too long without a proper scan. It was fast once it started. Faster than I had been able to prepare for, though I am not sure preparation is even a real thing when it comes to losing someone like that. I had held her hand and talked to her about the stars we still had not seen, and she had smiled and told me the map was not finished yet. And then she was gone. After that I ran cargo. I took salvage contracts. I went from station to station and did the work because the work was something to do, and doing something was better than stopping, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant feeling, and I was not ready for that yet. I carried her ring. It was a simple thing. Gold band, pale blue stone, small and plain and worth almost nothing to anyone who did not know its story. She had worn it on her right hand, not her left, because she said the left hand was for promises and she did not believe in promises, only in choices. She had chosen me every day for 3 years, and she wore the ring on the right hand to remind herself that love was a daily decision, not a contract. I wore it on a cord around my neck. I had not taken it off since the day the medics handed it to me with her other things in a small gray bag. The auction continued around me in languages and gestures I only half understood. The Velhari ran their auctions with a complex system of bioluminescent signals, harmonic bidding tones, and occasional scent pulses that I could not detect with human senses, but could see the other bidders responding to. I had a translation unit clipped to my collar that gave me about 70% comprehension, which was enough to follow the general shape of things without getting every detail. Lot after lot went by, machine parts, data cores, biological samples sealed in containment cases, a set of navigational charts from a system I recognized as being in contested space, which explained why the bidding on those was fast and sharp. I watched without bidding. I had come because there was a rumored lot of derelict drive components that might fit the Caraway's aging secondary propulsion system, and I wanted to look at them before someone else grabbed them. I had not expected to stay long. Then Lot 77 came up. It was small. That was the first thing I noticed. Most of the lots were large or at least medium-sized, things of obvious trade value. Lot 77 was a cryogenic stasis pod roughly the size of a cargo locker, sealed, dark-paneled, with no visible identification markings. The auctioneer described it in Velhari standard, and my translator gave me most of it, Unknown biological contents. Recovered from a derelict vessel in grid sector 42 of the outer lanes. Provenance unverified. Contents not inspected by the collective. Then the auctioneer added a phrase that made the entire room shift slightly. The way a crowd shifts when something uncomfortable enters the space. Class 7 emotive risk. I had no idea what that meant. I made a mental note to look it up later. Around me, the aliens who had been preparing to bid quietly put their signal devices down. One of the Dravari traders 3 rows ahead of me clicked something off on his console. A pair of Velhari merchants near the front exchanged what my translator rendered as a phrase somewhere between no thank you and not in this life. Within about 30 seconds of the classification announcement, the room had effectively withdrawn. The auctioneer opened the bidding low. Very low. The kind of low that says we would like this removed from our inventory and are not proud about the price. One bid came in, weak and uncertain, from a being near the side wall whose species I did not recognize. It was the kind of bid that said I am here and I suppose I am bidding, not I want this. And I thought about Elena. I thought about how she used to say that the things nobody wanted were usually the things that had the best stories. How she would stop at unmarked objects in trade markets and spend 20 minutes working out what they might be, where they came from, what life had been like for whoever made them. She had a gift for seeing value in things that had been abandoned. I raised my hand. The auctioneer saw me immediately. A human, bidding on the Class 7 lot. From the slight pause in the auctioneer's rhythm, I could tell this was not expected. My translator gave me something like registered, foreign bidder, proceed. The other bidder came back with a slightly higher number. Not enthusiastic, just covering the move. I went higher. They hesitated. Then they came back one more time, and it was the kind of bid that said I am doing this out of habit, not conviction. I had enough station credits for one more raise. Not a big one. I looked down at the cord around my neck and I felt the ring there, small and warm against my chest. I reached up and took it off. I walked to the nearest assessment terminal, the kind every auction floor had for on-the-spot item valuation, and I set the ring on the scanner. The machine hummed. The financial assessment came back almost instantly. Negligible material value. Then a second reading ran, slower, and a category I had never seen before appeared on the screen. My translator struggled with it for a moment, then offered. Artifact of significant personal resonance. Deep emotive encoding. Subjective value. Incalculable. I looked at the screen for a second. Then I logged the ring as supplemental collateral on my bid, added it to my offer, and raised my hand one final time. The room was very quiet. The other bidder looked at the updated bid terms, looked at the ring reading on the shared display, and sat back. The auctioneer counted down in 3 languages. Lot 77 was mine. I walked to the collection window feeling strange in a way I could not name. Not proud, not excited, not even particularly curious yet, though that would come. I picked up the pod transit paperwork, initialed the collective claim forms, and carried the ring back to my ship in my hand instead of on the cord, because I had not thought to put it back yet. I did not know what was in the pod. I did not know what the Class 7 classification meant. I did not know that the Velhari scanner had read something in that ring that would end up mattering more than anything I had bought or sold in 11 years of working the outer belt. I did not know any of it. I loaded the pod into the Caraway's cargo bay, secured it to the maglocks, and sat in the cockpit for a few minutes looking at the stars. Then I started the engine and headed out. 6 hours out from Velhari Crossing, with the station just a faint point of light behind me, and the Dravari belt spreading ahead in its usual pattern of slow-turning rock and dust. I went into the cargo bay and stood in front of the pod. It hummed quietly. The cryogenic systems were stable. The internal life sign indicator, a small green light on the upper left panel, was lit and steady. There was something alive in there. I had known that from the auction description, but knowing it abstractly and standing 2 feet away from it were different things. I put my hand flat on the surface and felt the faint vibration of the cooling system running. The pod was old, not ancient, but old enough that the design language was at least a decade behind current manufacturing. Whoever had made it had built it well. It had kept something alive through what might have been years of drifting in a derelict vessel in one of the least traveled sectors of the outer lanes. I stayed there for a while. Then I went back to the cockpit and looked up Class 7 emotive risk in the Velhari Trade Registry database. The entry was not long, but I read it 3 times. Class 7 emotive risk was a designation used by the collective for biological cargo or passengers whose psychological trauma profile, recorded prior to stasis or transport, exceeded a threshold considered hazardous to empathically sensitive species. Several species in the known trade systems had some degree of emotional resonance perception. They could feel the emotional states of beings near them, or in some cases the emotional echoes left in objects and spaces. For those species, proximity to a being who had experienced severe, unprocessed trauma was not just uncomfortable. It could be genuinely disorienting. In extreme cases, destabilizing. I sat with that for a moment. They had been afraid of whoever was in that pod because of how much pain that being was carrying. Every empathic species in that auction room had felt it and stepped back. I had not felt it because I could not. Human beings do not have that kind of perception. We are, as far as anyone in the known systems can determine, almost entirely emotionally opaque to other species, and almost entirely immune to emotional resonance fields from the outside. It had not occurred to me that this was unusual until I read that entry. I thought about the room going quiet when the lot came up. I thought about the other bidder sitting back. I thought about the Velhari elder watching me from the aisle. Maybe they had not been looking at me because I was human and therefore unusual. Maybe they had been watching to see if I would feel what they felt and stop. I had not stopped. I went back to the cargo bay. I looked at the pod for another long moment. Then I did something careful and something probably not recommended by any salvage operating manual. I began the slow wake cycle. I did it because Elena had a voice in my head that was not a ghost and not a delusion, just the memory of how she thought, the pattern of her reasoning that had lived with me long enough that I sometimes heard it when I needed to make a decision. And that voice said that something alive had been sealed in a box and left to drift, and that the reason no one had opened it was fear, and that fear was not a good enough reason for me. Not today, maybe not ever. The wake cycle was going to take about 8 hours. I set a proximity alarm in case anything came into my lane, made coffee I did not finish, and sat down on the cargo bay floor with my back against the wall and the ring on its cord in my hand. I waited. The light on the pod shifted from green to amber around the 6-hour mark, which meant the system was warming the internal temperature gradually. Around the 7-hour mark it began to pulse slowly, which I gathered meant the stasis field was releasing. I stood up. My back hurt. I rolled my shoulders and moved to a position about 4 feet from the pod door, close enough to see but far enough to give whatever came out room to move. The amber light turned white. The seal released with a low hiss and a rush of cold, sterile air that smelled faintly of ozone and something floral I could not place. The door opened. For a moment nothing happened. Then a hand appeared on the edge of the pod door, gripping it, small, silver gray, 4 fingers, each tipped with a short, curved nail. The grip was tight, knuckles pale with the effort of holding on. Then she came out. She was young. That was the first thing I understood. Not just young in the way that creatures who age slowly appear young. Young in the way that you can see in the shape of a face and the proportion of limbs and the particular quality of the eyes. A rawness, a not yet finished quality that speaks of someone who has not been alive very long. She was roughly my height, lean, her skin a cool silver gray, her hair dark and matted from the pod. Her eyes when they found me were amber. Awake in an instant in the way that prey animals are awake. All at once, no transition, no grogginess. She looked at me and she moved. Not toward the door, not in a panic. She went sideways, fast and low, and put her back against the cargo bay wall with the pod between us and her eyes on me, and her breathing fast and controlled and her hands raised in. A posture that was not welcoming. I did not move. I put my hands up, open, palms out. I had no idea if this gesture meant anything to her species. It felt right. I kept my voice low and even. "My name is Marcus," I said. "You are on my ship. You are safe." She did not lower her hands. We stayed like that for almost 2 minutes. Then I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned slowly, walked to the small cargo bay utility station, and put the kettle on. I made tea. I put the mug on the floor halfway between us, and then I stepped back. I sat down cross-legged on the floor as far from the mug as she was, and I waited. It took 11 minutes, I counted. Then, moving like she expected the floor to give way under her, she reached the mug and picked it up. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and looked at me, and then she lowered her face and breathed the steam in, and something in her shoulders changed. Not much, but enough. She did not say anything, neither did I. We sat in the cargo bay of the Caraway while the stars moved outside and the ship hummed around us, and I thought about what I had just done. It might mean and whether I had any idea at all how to do what came next, I did not. But she was breathing, she was warm, she had tea. For now, that felt like enough. Her name took 3 days to learn. Not because she would not tell me. She told me on the first night, in a language that sounded like water moving over smooth stone, syllables that rose and fell in a pattern my ears could hear but could not hold. My translation unit, which handled 17 of the known trade languages, processed her speech for 40 seconds and returned a single word. unidentified. I named the language myself in my log. I called it Orin. I did not know then that it already had a name. I did not know much of anything yet. What I knew on that first night was this: she was not going to hurt me. She had moved away from the wall by the end of the second hour, slowly, and with the careful deliberateness of someone who was making a decision with each step rather than moving on instinct. She had looked at every part of the cargo bay with a systematic attention that reminded me of the way a technician surveys a space before starting work. She checked the exits. She checked the pod she had come out of. She checked the utility station, the storage racks, the maglock points on the floor. She was cataloging, building a map of the space she was in. I watched her do it and said nothing, because it seemed like something she needed to finish before anything else could happen. When she was done, she sat down on the floor near the far wall, not cornered, with clear lines to both the exit and the pod, and she looked at me. I pointed to myself, Marcus. She looked at the pointing finger, then she looked at my face. Then she said something, a short phrase, careful and deliberate, and my translation unit said, query, location. She wanted to know where she was. That was the beginning. I found a navigation display tablet in the storage rack and pulled up a sector map. I set it on the floor between us. I pointed to the Draveri belt marker. She leaned forward and looked at the map with an attention so focused it was almost physical, and I saw her jaw tighten and her breathing change, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. She knew where the Draveri belt was, and knowing it meant something to her that was not comfortable. She pointed at the map herself, at a system about 3 sectors north of our current position. The Velhari Trade Registry called it Grid 44, and there was almost nothing there in the official records except a notation that the system had been surveyed and cleared of significant assets about 12 years ago. I had passed through the outer edge of it twice on salvage runs and had never stopped. There was nothing to stop for. She held her finger on that grid square for a long moment. Then she sat back and she said something else, short and flat, and my translation unit was quiet for 2 full seconds before it gave me all. I looked at her. She looked at me. Gone all. I did not ask her what she meant that night. It felt like a door that should stay closed until we had the language to go through it properly. Over the next 2 days, I rigged a translation solution that was not elegant but was functional. My unit had enough base data on extinct and fringe trade languages to attempt cross-referencing hers, and once it found 3 root cognates with the old Orin dialect entries in the Velhari linguistic archive, it built fast, not perfectly, with gaps and approximations and the occasional phrase that came back as something absurd. But well enough. On the 3rd morning, she came into the cockpit, where I was running the caraway through its usual maintenance sequence, and she stood in the doorway and said, in careful, slow, slightly accented standard, Sava. I turned around. She pointed at herself. Sava, I said. She nodded. She looked like someone who had just placed a stone in a wall and was checking whether it held. Marcus, I said, pointing at myself. I know, she said. You told me 3 days ago. Her standard was already better than my Oran, and I had been practicing. I laughed. It surprised me. It had not happened in a while. She did not quite smile, but something in her face shifted toward it. The way light shifts when a cloud moves briefly before the sky closes again. We started talking. Not about the big things yet, about the ship first. She was curious about the caraway in the way that a person who has spent a long time in a very small space is curious about a slightly larger space. She wanted to know how things worked. She asked about the propulsion system, the recycler, the navigation array. She asked about the food synthesizer with what I can only describe as professional skepticism, tried it once, and declared it tolerable, which felt like high praise from someone who looked at most things with the careful assessment of a person who had learned not to trust easily. I asked her how old she was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, biologically, I am 27. In terms of the time that has passed in the world while I was in stasis, I am 38. I did not understand the math at first. Then I did, and it hit me harder than I expected. She had been 16 years old when she went into that pod. 16. And the world had continued for 11 years while she slept in a container in a derelict ship, drifting through grid sector 42. I wanted to ask who put her there. I wanted to ask why. But I had learned in those 3 days that Sava moved through information the way she moved, through physical spaces, on her own terms, in her own time, and with a clear awareness of what she was ready to approach. So I waited. She told me on the 4th day. We were in the small common area, which on the caraway was really just a table and 2 chairs and a viewport, and she had been looking at the stars for a while, in a way that was different from idle looking. It was the way you look at something when you are deciding whether to speak. There was a purge, she said. The words sat between us. A political action, she continued. And the way she said political had a flatness in it that told me she knew perfectly well it was not really a political word in this context, that she was using it because the other words were worse. Organized by the conglomerate faction, against my people. The Oran had heard of the Oran. Vaguely, a biological survey entry in the trade registry, marked as extinct. I had processed that information once and moved on. The way you process most entries in a database that does not directly affect your work. I was ashamed of that now. My mother hid me, Sava said. She found the pod through a contact she had in the outer trade networks. Someone who helped people disappear. She put me in it herself. She told me I would sleep for a little while and wake up somewhere safer. She paused. She was right about the sleeping. She did not say what she was not right about. She did not need to. Do you know what happened to her? I asked. I know what happened to my whole people, she said. I have known since I woke up and you showed me the sector map and I saw what that registry says. Next to grid 44. She looked at her hands. Cleared of significant assets. That is what they call us in the record. I did not know what to say to that. I am not sure there's anything to say to that. I sat with it because that was the only honest thing to do. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. Your people, Marcus, how many of you are there? Humans, I said. Billions. Multiple settled worlds, she nodded slowly. My people numbered about 400,000 at the time of the purge. She looked up at me. The registry says none, not diminished, not dispersed, none. 400,000 people. Gone all. I thought about the translation unit's very first reading of her words on that first night, and felt something cold move through my chest. You said biologically 27, I said carefully. What does that mean exactly? She looked at me with an expression that was measuring something. Not suspicion. More like deciding how much of a thing to hand to someone before you know if they can hold it. The Oran do not age during stasis, she said. Not in any measurable way. I went into the pod at 16. My body continued its development slightly because the stasis was not perfect. It was a quick build unit, not military grade. So I am physically somewhere between 22 and 25. But mentally, experientially. She stopped. I am 16. I went in at 16. I came out 11 years later. I have the memories of a child and the body of an adult and the knowledge of a history that ended while I was asleep. She said all of this very evenly. I recognized that evenness. I had used it myself every day for 7 months. It was the tone you use when the thing you are talking about is so large that if you let any feeling into your voice, the whole structure will come apart. I am sorry, I said. She looked at me directly. You did not do this, I said. But I am sorry anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why did you bid on the pod? At the auction. You were the only one who did not stop when they announced the classification. I thought about lying, or simplifying. I thought about saying I was curious, or that I had misunderstood the classification, or that I was just impulsive. I had a bad few months, I said instead. My wife died. I was running on empty. I walked into that auction because I needed something to do, and I bid on your pod because no one else would, and I had just enough left in me to be annoyed by that. She considered it. Something sealed in a box, I said, something alive, left to drift because everyone was too uncomfortable to look at it. That bothered me. Your wife, she said, the ring, the one on the cord. I touched it without thinking. Yes, you put it on the scanner. The credits were not enough alone. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a tone I could not fully read but which had lost some of its evenness, just a little, just enough. You gave away the only piece of her you have left. For a box you did not even know the contents of. I did not give it away, I said. It was collateral. I got it back. But you were willing to. I did not answer. She looked at the viewport for a while. Then she said, among my people there was a concept. I do not have the standard word for it exactly. The closest is something like grace and emptiness. The particular kind of generosity that only belongs to someone who has lost so much that they have stopped counting the cost of giving. I looked at my hands. It is not meant as a compliment or a condemnation, she said, only as a thing that is true. Outside the viewport, the Dravari belt drifted in its slow ancient pattern, rocks older than any of our histories turning in the dark. I stayed with what she had said. Later that night, after she had gone to sleep in the crew cabin I had given her, I went to the cockpit and sat with the stars and thought about Elena and about the ring, and about a 16-year-old girl put to sleep in a box by a mother who loved her enough to know she would not survive any other way. I thought about what the world must look like to someone who had gone to sleep in one era and woken up in the wreckage of everything that era had contained. I thought about what Sava had said, not as a condemnation. I looked at the navigation screen and checked our current heading, outbound from Velhari Crossing. No specific destination logged. The default route I used when I had a contract to finish and nowhere particular to be after. I changed the destination to Harrow Station, the nearest major hub, neutral ground, good medical facilities. The kind of place where a person could begin to figure out what came next. It was not a plan. It was only a direction. But directions were something. After 7 months of going in circles, they were more than something. I set the course, leaned back in my chair, and let the ship run. In the back of my mind, the part that still sounded like Elena, I heard something very quiet. Good, it said. Now you are moving towards something again. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep for a long time, but I rested, which was different, and which was the best I had managed in months. Sava was alive. She was here. She had a name and a history and a language and a grief bigger than any I had encountered. And she had looked at me across a cargo bay floor with a cup of tea in her hands and measured whether I was worth the risk of staying near. Apparently she had decided I was. I was going to try very hard to be worth it. By the time we reached Harrow Station 2 days later, Sava's standard was nearly conversational. She had been running the translation unit on her own while I slept, working through vocabulary banks with a focus that I found slightly alarming in its intensity. When I woke on the second morning and came into the common area, she was sitting with the unit's learning module spreads across the table, and she had filled 4 pages of my paper logbook with notes, standard words written in her own script alongside Oron equivalents, building herself a bridge between 2 worlds. I made coffee. I set a cup in front of her. She picked it up, tried it, and put it back down with an expression that clearly meant she was not going to say anything negative about something I had just made for her, but was also absolutely not going to drink more of it. You do not like coffee, I said. I do not understand it, she said carefully. The tea I understand. The tea is warm and it has a reason. Coffee is aggressive. I laughed again 2 times in 5 days, a record. She did not quite smile, but she watched me laugh with an expression that was interested, as if she was studying what it looked like when a person found something genuinely funny and was trying to remember what that felt like. I thought about that later. About someone who had not laughed in 11 years, not because they were humorless, but because there had been nothing to laugh at, and no one to laugh with, and no world left in which laughing was something that still happened. I thought, I am going to have to do something about this. Not fix it. You cannot fix something like that, but maybe make a space where it could happen again, gradually at its own speed. We docked at Harrow Station on the 2nd afternoon. I took Sava through the registration process as a found-at-large passenger, which was technically correct and also the path of least paperwork. The station clerk asked no interesting questions. We were assigned temporary berthing passes, and I showed Sava the station's public ring, the wide corridor that ran the full circumference of the middle level, where all the trade shops and food vendors and open spaces were. She stopped in the middle of the walkway and just stood there. People and beings moved around her in every direction. Light came from 1,000 sources, sounds layered over each other, conversations in 6 languages, music from a vendor's stall, the mechanical hum of the station, the distant clang of cargo lifts. The smells were complex and overlapping and completely unlike anything in the Caraway's recycled air. She stood in the middle of all of it and she breathed. I stood next to her and waited. After about a minute she said, very quietly, "It is very loud." "It is," I agreed. "I have not been anywhere loud in a long time." A pause. "I think I missed it." We stood there a little longer. Then she said, "Marcus, what happens now?" It was the question I had been thinking about since I changed our heading. What happens now? For her specifically, but also in a smaller way that I did not yet examine closely for me. "We figure it out," I said, "one step at a time." She looked at me sideways with an expression I was learning to read as skeptical but not unkind. "That is not a plan." "No," I agreed, "but it is the honest answer." She considered this. Then she said, and I heard in it the faint shape of something that might one day become a real smile. "I suppose honest is a reasonable place to start." She was right. It was. The message from the Velhari Collective came 9 days after the auction. I was in the Harrow Station maintenance bay running a diagnostic on the Caraway's secondary drive, which had been making a sound I described as a reluctant grinding, and the ship's system described as within acceptable tolerance, and we both knew only one of us was right. Sava was in the station's public library 2 levels up, which she had discovered on our 2nd day, and had not left voluntarily since except for meals. She had found that the library's archive contained partial records of Oron language and culture, compiled by a xenolinguist who had visited Grid 44 before the purge, and she had been working through those records with the same focused intensity she applied to everything that had a tangible outcome. I had not interrupted her. Some things you have to do alone and at your own speed, and with no one watching. The message arrived through the collective's official trade relay, and it was formal in the way that only interspecies bureaucratic communication can be formal, which is to say it used approximately 4 times as many words as necessary and managed to be both politely worded and quietly alarming at the same time. I read it twice, then I sat down on a cargo crate and read it again. The summary was this: my supplemental collateral at the Lot 77 auction, specifically the ring I had placed on the assessment terminal, had triggered a flag in the collective's post-auction audit system, not because of the ring's material value, because of its classification. The scanner had read it as an artifact of significant personal resonance with deep emotive encoding, and in Velhari trade law, offering an item of that classification as collateral on a biological lot was not merely a financial transaction. It was, according to Velhari customary right, Article 7, subsection 14 of the Collective Trade and Custody Code, a formal declaration of custodial claim, the right of custodial bond. I had no idea what that was, the message helpfully explained. In Velhari cultural tradition, the right of custodial bond was an ancient custom predating the trade collective by several centuries. When a being placed an item of profound personal significance as collateral on the purchase of another living being, it was interpreted not as a financial act but as a vow, an oath of guardianship, a declaration that the purchaser was binding their own welfare and fate to the welfare and fate of what they had bought. The rite was typically performed deliberately, in full knowledge of its meaning, by beings who were making a serious, lifelong commitment. I had done it accidentally while thinking about Elena and being mildly irritated at an auction crowd. The message went on to say that the Velhari collective took the rite very seriously, that it had legal standing within their jurisdiction, and that my registration of Sava, as a found-at-large passenger, was now being reviewed in light of the rite's implications. The review was not threatening in tone, but it was thorough, and it was official, and attached to it was a notice that a collective administrative tribunal had been scheduled for 14 days hence at Velhari Crossing to determine the legal status of my custodial claim and to formalize the terms of my declared bond. I was required to attend. Sava was required to attend. At the bottom of the message, almost as a footnote, was a brief note from the collective's cultural liaison. It said, "Human attendees are advised that the Velhari understanding of this right carries significant obligations. The collective recommends that the claimant obtain representation familiar with both collective customary law and the specific implications." Article 714 before the tribunal date. I sat on the crate for a while longer, then I went to find Sava. She was at a reading terminal in the library's back section, surrounded by a collection of opened archive files, and she was so deep in what she was reading that I had to say her name 3 times before she looked up. Her eyes, when they met mine, had the particular look of someone being pulled back from a very long distance. "Something happened," she said immediately. It was not a question. I sat down in the chair next to her and pulled up the message on my communicator and handed it to her. She read it. She read it again. Her expression did not change very much, but I had spent 9 days learning to read the small shifts in her face, and I saw her jaw tighten, and her breathing slow in the deliberate way it did when she was processing something that required her to stay steady. She handed the communicator back. "You did not know," she said. "I did not know," I confirmed. "I was using the ring to make up the credit difference. I did not know it meant anything else." The scanner read it as an emotive artifact, she said. In Velhari tradition, offering something like that on a living lot is as close to a sworn oath as their culture has. She paused. "Your wife's ring carries her in it, Marcus, to empathic species, to the Velhari scanner." They did not read the metal, they read what is in the metal. I looked at the communicator. "What does the right actually mean?" I asked. "Practically. In terms of what they will expect at the tribunal. It means," she said carefully, "that you will need to either formally ratify the bond under their code, or formally renounce it. Renouncing it carries penalties under their law, because renouncing a custodial bond is considered a serious breach of honor. Ratifying it carries obligations." She looked at me. "But primarily it means that whoever made this declaration is considered, in the eyes of the collective, to be responsible for the being they claimed. Guardian, advocate, protector. I can live with that," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "You understand what you are agreeing to." "I understand what I am agreeing to. You have known me for 9 days." "I know," I said. "But I knew something about you before I ever opened that pod. I knew that no one was bidding on you. I knew that an entire room of beings felt something coming from that container and backed away. And I know that the reason I did not back away was not because I am particularly brave or particularly wise. It was because I was already so empty that the weight of it did not register. She looked at me steadily. But I am not empty now, I said. Not as much, and I am still not backing away. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I need to tell you something about the archive. I waited. The xenolinguist's records, she said, the ones I have been reading. There is a section I found this morning that I have been sitting with for several hours, because I was not certain how to bring it to you. She touched the terminal lightly with one finger. The Oran have a biological feature, a genetic one. My people were not simply a culture and a language. There is something physical in the Oran bloodline, a gland system, a biological archive. It holds the complete record of our species, history, language, art, biological and genetic data, everything. I felt the weight of that before she said the next part. It is encoded in the bloodline and activated at maturity, she continued. I have not reached that activation point yet. I was in stasis during the years when it would have happened naturally. The activation requires a specific physiological process that I have not undergone. But the archive itself is already in me. She looked at me directly. I am, as far as I know, the last Oron, which means I am the only remaining vessel for everything my people were. And I did not know this until this morning. The silence in the library was very complete. Does anyone else know? I asked. The conglomerate faction that ordered the purge will know that the archive exists, she said. They may not know I survived. But if anyone in that room at the auction transmitted data about the Lot 77 contents back to any conglomerate-connected network, they may know now that an Oran was in that pod. I thought about the beings in the auction room. The ones who had withdrawn from bidding. The ones who had looked at me. We need a lawyer, I said. We need more than a lawyer, she said. A lawyer first, I said. Then we figure out the more. I did not have many contacts in the legal world. I had one which was a man named Owen Hale, who I had met 3 years ago at Harrow Station, when he was representing a cargo dispute I had a stake in, and who had won the case by delivering an argument so unexpectedly emotional and technically creative that the arbitration panel had approved it mostly out of astonishment. He was not a specialist in interspecies trade law. He was not, strictly speaking, a specialist in anything. What he was resourceful in a very specific way. He understood people, which in the outer station world meant he understood beings, which meant he understood what mattered to the entities making decisions, and he could speak to that directly. I found him at the same bar at Harrow Station where I had found him 3 years ago, which either said something about his habits or about the fact that Harrow Station had only 2 bars, and one of them had better light. He was a large man, not tall but solid, with a shaved head and a beard that had not been trimmed recently, and the kind of calm eyes that belong either to very dangerous people or to very patient ones. In Owen's case, it was emphatically the latter. He looked at me when I sat down, then at Sava, who sat down next to me with the careful precision of someone who had decided she was going to trust a person she had not met yet because the situation required it, and she was not in the habit of wasting time on uncertainty. Tell me everything, Owen said. So I did. He listened without interrupting, which was his particular gift. He let the whole story unfold, the auction, the ring, the pod, the 9 days, the collective message, what Sava had told me about the archive. He kept his hands flat on the table and his expression neutral, and his eyes moving, between me and Sava as each new piece came forward. When I finished, he was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said, the right of custodial bond. Yes, I said. Under Article 714, yes. He picked up his drink, considered it, put it back down. And you performed it accidentally. I did not know what it was. The Velhari will not care about that, he said. The intent behind the right is read through the object, not the knowledge of the person offering it. The scanner found genuine emotive resonance. In their view, the ring spoke for you, and what it said was, I will take responsibility for this. Can they enforce that? I asked. They can if you go to the tribunal, he said. If you do not go, they will read that as renunciation, and you will have trade access problems in every Velhari-affiliated station in the belt, which is most of them. He looked at Sava, and she will be unregistered, which makes her status in any collective jurisdiction complicated, Sava said. Define complicated. Owen said, unregistered biological in a post-purge classification is not something you want to be in collective space without a registered guardian or documented origin status. Sava took a long, slow breath. So we attend the tribunal. We attend the tribunal, I said. Owen said, I will represent you, both of you. He paused. I will need 3 days to prepare, and I will need full access to the collective's documentation on the lot, the right, and her stasis records. Done, I said. He looked at me, then at Sava, then back at me. There was something in his expression that I could not quite name, something between respect and something more personal, a kind of recognition. You put down your wife's ring, he said, not as a question, just saying it out loud. I did. He nodded slowly. I knew a man once who put down a great deal more than that, for less reason. It went badly for him. He picked up his drink again. I find that the ones who make those kinds of choices without knowing they are making them are usually the ones who mean it most. He drank. I will see you in 14 days at Velhari Crossing, he said. Do not do anything complicated before then. I thought about everything that was already complicated. I will do my best, I said. He gave me the look of a man who had heard that before. In the 12 days between that conversation and the tribunal, several things happened that I would not have predicted. Sava learned to make tea correctly, which she considered important, not the act of making it, the choosing of it, the small deliberate ritual of it. The thing Elena had always said was not really about the tea at all, but about the pause that the tea created. Sava had understood this within about 4 minutes of watching me do it, and I had understood that she understood it, and neither of us said anything about it, which was its own kind of language. She also started drawing. She had found a set of marking tools in the station's supply market and a stack of blank sheets, and she filled them. Not with pictures exactly, more with patterns. Complex interlocking shapes that her hands seemed to know without her planning them. She told me once, when I asked, that Oran children learn to record memory in pattern before they learn to record it in word, that the shapes were not decoration but information, a script that her hands remembered, even if the conscious part of her was not yet sure what it was writing. I kept them. I stacked them carefully, and I put them in the Caraway's document safe. I did not ask permission. She saw me do it and said nothing, which I understood to mean she was allowing it. I thought often in those 12 days about what Owen had said. The ones who make those choices without knowing they are making them usually mean it most. I thought about standing at that assessment terminal with Elena's ring in my hand and the whole auction waiting, and no particular plan in my head. I had not been thinking about vows. I had not been thinking about responsibility or guardianage or any of the language the collective was now applying to what I had done. I had been thinking about a room full of beings, stepping back from something alive because it hurt to be near it, and about how that seemed wrong to me in a way I could not entirely articulate but which was very loud in my chest. That was all. But sometimes all is enough. Sometimes all is everything. Owen arrived 2 days before the tribunal with a carry bag full of printed documents and a look on his face that said he had slept a reasonable amount but not an ideal amount, and he immediately began preparing us for what was going to happen. The tribunal would have 4 adjudicators, 2 Vilhari elders, 1 Dravari trade magistrate, 1 representative from the neutral Harrow Accord, who was there to ensure no single species customs overwhelmed the others. The conglomerate faction had not filed a formal objection yet. Owen said the word yet with a particular flatness that I understood to mean he thought they would, and he was preparing for it. He was right. On the morning of the tribunal, as we were walking to the collective's hearing chamber, an official notification arrived on my communicator from a conglomerate-affiliated legal entity. It said that Lot 77 had been acquired through a process that contained multiple procedural irregularities, that the Article 7:14 right had been performed without the informed consent of either party, and that the conglomerate faction was formally requesting that the tribunal expand its scope to include a review of the biological contents of the lot. Sava read it over my shoulder. She said, "They know." Owen said, "Yes." Which means we have about 40 minutes before this becomes a different kind of hearing. We walked faster. The chamber was already full. The Vilhari tribunal chamber was circular, which was traditional for Vilhari deliberative spaces, and it had 12 rows of tiered seating around a central floor with a speaking platform at the center. It was designed to feel less like a courtroom and more like a conversation, which I appreciated in principle and found in practice to be only partially true, because the 4 adjudicators, seated at the curved bench at the far end, had the specific stillness of people who were holding a great deal of power, very quietly, and that does not feel like a conversation no matter what the room looks like. The gallery was fuller than I had expected. Word traveled fast in the station networks, and a Class 7 lot, a human bidder, a custodial right performed in ignorance, and a conglomerate legal challenge filed the morning of the tribunal, made a combination that apparently had significant drawing power. I counted at least 40 beings in the gallery before I stopped counting. Several I recognized as trade contacts or familiar station faces. A few I did not recognize at all, and the ones I did not recognize were the ones I watched most carefully. Owen walked me and Sava to the designated seats on the left side of the central floor and leaned between us to speak quietly. The conglomerate's representative is the tall one in the 3rd row. His name is Veth, He is a Dravari advocate, and he is very good. I have argued against him twice. We split one each. He paused. Their case will rest on procedural grounds first. The right was uninformed. It should be voided. Custody reverts to default unregistered status. Then they will try to shift to the biological review, which is where it gets complicated. What happens if they get the biological review? I asked. They do not get the biological review, Owen said. With a certainty I was glad to hear, even if I did not entirely share it. The lead adjudicator, a Velhari elder of advanced age whose 4 pale eyes moved slowly across the chamber, called the session to order in Standard and 2 other languages simultaneously. The translation units in the room covered the rest. The formal charges and claims were read. My original auction registration, the Article 7.14 flag, the conglomerate's morning of challenge. It took about 12 minutes to establish the full procedural record, and I sat through it with my hands in my lap, and Sava sitting very straight, beside me with her gaze forward and her breathing even. I had seen her do this before. Go still in a particular way. It was not passivity. It was the way a person who has lived through something very large learns to contain themselves, so the largeness does not show in ways they have not chosen. Veth, the conglomerate's advocate, presented first. He was exactly what Owen had said, very good. He was calm, organized, and he made the procedural argument with a clarity that I could follow even without legal training. The rite had been performed without the bidder's knowledge of its meaning. No informed consent had been given. The scanner classification of the ring, while technically accurate under Velhari emotive reading standards, could not be held to constitute a conscious vow by someone who did not know that reading existed. Therefore, Article 7.14 could not be applied in good faith. The custodial claim was invalid, and the biological contents of Lot 77 should be classified as unregistered in accordance with standard post-lot processing. He did not say what standard post-lot processing meant for an unregistered biological with ORAN origin designation. He did not need to. I knew. Owen knew. The 4 adjudicators knew. Sava knew. Owen stood up. He looked for a moment at the adjudicators, not performing, just looking at them the way a person looks at other people when they are about to say something they mean. Then he began. He started with the law. Of course he did. He was representing us in a legal proceeding and the law had to come first. He addressed the procedural argument directly. The Velhari rite, under its own historical framework, had never required conscious knowledge of its terms on the part of the person performing it. The cultural precedent was that the object spoke, not the mind. He cited 4 historical cases from the collective's own archive in which the rite had been upheld despite the offering party being unaware of its formal implications. He cited the scanner's reading as primary evidence under Article 7.14's own language. He built the legal case carefully and thoroughly, and it was solid work, the kind that needed to be done. And then he stopped doing the legal work. He looked at the adjudicators and he said, I want to speak for a moment about what actually happened in this auction room. Not as a matter of law, as a matter of fact. Veth made a sound of objection. The lead adjudicator waved it down with a minimal gesture that said, proceed. A man walked into this room, Owen said. He is 34 years old. 7 months before this auction, he watched his wife die. He has been running a salvage route alone ever since, because working is the only way he knows how to keep moving. He walked into this auction without a plan. He sat in the back row and watched lot after lot go by, and he did not bid on anything because nothing reached him. He paused. Then a lot came up that the entire room stepped back from. A lot whose classification announced to every empathically sensitive being in this chamber that whatever was inside it was carrying a pain so large that proximity to it was considered a risk. And every being in this room who could feel that pain chose, reasonably and understandably, not to sit with it. Another pause. Marcus Ray did not feel it. Not because he is callous, because humans do not have that perception. He felt something else instead. He felt the familiar shape of something alive being left behind. Something that had a story. Something that no one wanted to look at. And something in him said, I do not think that is acceptable. Owen moved to the central platform. He placed his wife's ring on the scanner because he did not have enough credits. That is the practical reality. But the scanner read that ring and found something in it that the Velar Pi tradition calls an emotive artifact of the highest order. Years of love, lived in an object small enough to hold in one hand. The scanner did not read metal. It read what 2 people had put into that metal by choosing each other every day for 3 years. And the rite says, when such an object is offered, the offering is genuine, the offering is a vow. Not because the person understood the legal terminology, because the object itself told the truth about the person holding it. He turned to face the adjudicators fully. The conglomerate's case rests on the idea that ignorance of the right's meaning should void the right. But the Velhari tradition does not rest on legal knowledge. It rests on genuine intent, expressed through genuine offering. And I am telling you that a man who carries his dead wife's ring around his neck for 7 months, and then places it on an auction platform rather, than let something living be abandoned is a man whose intent does not require translation. He looked at me briefly. He did not know what the ring said to your scanner. He did not know what the right meant. He only knew that something alive was in that pod, and that no one else was going to bid. And he reached for the only thing he had left. The chamber was very quiet. Owen said, "That is not ignorance. That is the truest expression of what your right was designed to recognize. And I ask this tribunal to honor it." He sat down. I realized I had stopped breathing at some point during the last part of that and started again. Slowly, beside me, Sava had not moved. But I saw at the corner of her eye a brightness that she did not wipe away. The adjudicators conferred. Not quickly. They took 20 minutes, which felt much longer, during which the chamber held a low buzz of murmured conversation that my translation unit turned into a background wash of speculation I did not try to follow. I kept my eyes on the central platform and kept my breathing steady. Veth made 2 further procedural motions during the deliberation period. Both were received, considered, and set aside. He made the request for biological review formally, in writing, submitted to the bench. The lead adjudicator read it and passed it to the other 3 without visible reaction. When the adjudicators returned to their bench, the chamber went quiet immediately. The lead adjudicator spoke. The right, he said, was upheld. The Article 7:14 custodial claim was formally recognized. Marcus Reyes was registered as Sava's legal guardian under Velhari Collective Code. The ring's reading constituted sufficient evidence of genuine intent under the right's own historical precedent. The vote had been 4 in favor, 0 opposed. The conglomerate's request for biological review was denied on the grounds that the reviewed party was now registered under a valid custodial bond and therefore not subject to unregistered biological processing. Veth stood and said something formal and flat about reserving the right to appeal. The lead adjudicator noted it without inflection. And that was it. Owen exhaled. It was the first sound I had heard him make that was not completely controlled. 4-0, he said quietly. I did not expect 4-0. You were very good, I said. I said true things, he said. True things are usually the easiest material to work with. Sava was still looking at the adjudicator's bench. Then she's looked at me. And the brightness was still there in the corner of her eye, and she said very quietly, "It held." "What held?" I asked. "The thing you put in the ring," she said. "It held in the room." I could feel everyone feeling it while he spoke, even the ones who were against us. She paused. "Love that is genuine does not disappear when the person carrying it disappears. Your wife did something for me today, Marcus, and she did not even know I existed." I held very still for a moment. Then I reached up and touched the ring on the cord at my neck. Owen was already on his communicator, dealing with the post-tribunal paperwork, which was apparently considerable. Beings from the gallery were filing out around us. The chamber was emptying with the specific efficiency of a space that has served its purpose and been released. I became aware, slowly, the group of 3 beings who had been seated in the gallery's far section, near the upper tier, had not filed out with the others. They were still in their seats, not moving, not looking at anything in particular, present in the way that people are present when they are waiting to be noticed. I noticed them. One of them met my eyes briefly, and then looked away. I leaned over to Owen. The 3 in the upper tier who did not leave. He glanced up, paused. "They are not gallery observers," he said. "I recognize the one on the left. He is a conglomerate-affiliated courier. He has been at 3 different stations where I have had cases involving conglomerate parties. He is not there to witness. He is there to report." "Report what?" Owen folded his communicator closed. "That the tribunal failed, that the claim was upheld, that the Oran survivor is registered and protected." He looked at me directly. "And that they need a different approach." "Meaning what?" "Meaning," Owen said carefully, "that the legal route has closed and they will now look for another one." He kept his voice low. "I am going to tell you something that I want you to hear clearly. Winning this tribunal was significant. It protects Sava within Velhari collective jurisdiction. But the conglomerate does not only operate within Velhari collective jurisdiction." I looked at the 3 beings in the upper tier. "How long?" I asked. "Before they try something," Owen said. "They are already trying. The morning of challenge was not a genuine legal attempt. It was a reconnaissance move. They wanted to see what we had, who I was, how prepared we were." He stood. "We need to get off this station, not urgently but soon. Tonight." I looked at Sava. She had heard all of it. She was looking at the three beings in the upper tier with an expression that was not afraid. It was something older and quieter than fear, the expression of someone who had already lived through the worst version of this story and was now deciding whether to live through it differently. "This, Sci-Fi said." She looked at me. "Tonight," I said. "We leave tonight." She nodded once. "I know," she said. "I have known since they filed the morning challenge. They are not done." She stood, "But neither are we." Owen guided us out through a side corridor, rather than the main chamber exit, which took us around the back of the administrative section, and through a service passage that opened near the docking ring. We moved at a normal pace, which Owen said was better than hurrying, because hurrying on a station looked like running, and running attracted attention. The Caraway was in Bay 14. I had left it fueled for a 2-week run because I always left it fueled, because 11 years of salvage work had taught me that the worst moment to need fuel is the moment when you need to leave suddenly. That habit, which had started as practical sense, and had over the years become something close to superstition, was today exactly what it needed to be. We loaded what we had. Sava's drawings were already in the document safe. Her few things fit in one bag. Owen had nothing, because he had not planned to leave the station, and he said he had been in worse situations with less, which I believed. We undocked at 2200 station time. The Velhari crossing traffic control gave us departure clearance without delay. The docking ring fell away behind us. The station's light grew smaller, and then became one of many lights, and then the Dravari belt opened up ahead, in its ancient rolling dark, and I set a heading that was not toward any particular destination but was away, which was enough for now. In the co-pilot seat, Sava sat with one of her marked sheets on her knee and a drawing tool in her hand, and she was making shapes without looking down. At the page, her eyes on the stars, her hands moving from memory. Owen was in the galley making tea, which he had learned to do in approximately 15 minutes by watching Sava once and asking 2 questions. I set the autopilot and turned to look at her. "What are you drawing?" I asked. She looked down at the sheet for the first time since she had started. She held it up. It was my face, not a portrait exactly. More an impression of it done in her script pattern style. The shapes that were not decoration but information. My face in a language I could not read. "What does it say?" I asked. She looked at it for a moment. "The thing in Oran that means a person who does not know their own worth, who gives without measuring the giving, who carries something precious and uses it for others without pausing to protect it for himself." She lowered the sheet. We did not have a short word for it. It took several shapes. I thought about several answers to that. What I said was, "Elena would have liked you." Sava was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Tell me about her." And so I did. For the first time since I had lost her, in any real way, I told the story. Not the grief of losing her, not the hollow weight of the months after, but her, the person, the cartographer who stayed for the view. The woman who wore her ring on the right hand because love was a choice. The one who made me laugh in cargo bays and taught me that the things nobody wanted had the best stories. I talked for a long time. Sava listened with her full attention, the way she did everything, and she did not try to comfort me, and she did not try to fix anything, and that was exactly right. Outside, the stars held still, the way they always had and always would, patient and enormous and older than any grief any of us had ever carried. We moved through them. We were not finished yet, not by a long distance, but we were moving and we were together, and for now that was enough. 2 years later, on a station called Peregrine 5 near the edge of charted space, a woman named Dr. Adele Marsh activated the Oran archive in Sava's genome, and the world changed again. Not the whole world, but ours. Adele was the xenobiologist Owen had found. Finding her had taken 7 months, and the kind of network digging that Owen was particularly gifted at. And when we finally located her, she was on a research contract in the outer belt, and she was one of only 3 living specialists in Oran biology, and she had spent 6 years believing there was nothing left to apply her knowledge to. When Owen reached her, she did not say yes immediately. She spent 4 hours asking questions about Sava, about the archive, about the stasis records, about the genotype documentation the Xenolinguist archive had contained. Then she said yes, and she said it in the tone of someone who has been waiting for a reason that mattered. We had not gone directly to her. The 2 years between the tribunal and Peregrine 5 had not been still. The conglomerate's second approach, as Owen had predicted, came not through a legal channel but through a less formal one. 6 weeks after we left Velhari Crossing, a vessel appeared on the Caraway's long-range sensor while we were in transit between Harrow Station and the Pellery resupply point. It stayed at the outer edge of detection range for 11 hours, not approaching, not announcing, just present in the particular way that things are present When they want you to know they are there. I did not panic. I ran the engines at standard speed. I kept our heading unchanged. I had Owen monitor the comms for any transmissions from the vessel, and I had Sava run the cargo bay systems check, which was busy work but which she did without complaint because she understood why I needed her occupied and calm, rather than watching the sensor screen for 11 hours. At hour 12, the vessel changed course and fell back. It did not follow us to Pellery. Owen said, "Reconnaissance. Second kind. They wanted to know if you would run, and now they know I will not," I said. "They know you will not run uselessly," he said. "Which means they will look for a moment when running or not running is irrelevant." He looked at the sensor screen where the other vessel had been. "We need to keep moving. Not panicked moving. Strategic moving." That was how the next 2 years worked. We moved. We took contracts, salvage work for me, occasional translation and archive work for Sava, whose command of standard and several other trade languages had become something that actually had market value in the outer station networks. We built a small amount of financial stability, enough to not be desperate, not enough to be comfortable. Owen stayed with us, partly because the situation required a legal mind nearby and partly, I thought, because he had nowhere particular to be, and the Caraway had turned out to be a more interesting place than the bar at Harrow Station. Sava grew. Not in the way children grow, not in height or proportion, but in the way that a person who has been held very still for a very long time grows when the stillness finally ends. She began to laugh. Not often and not loudly, not in the easy unguarded way of someone who has always felt safe, but genuinely when something struck her as absurd or unexpectedly clever, a sound that started in the back of her throat and came out reluctant and then real. The first time it happened, we were arguing about the food synthesizer, which was her least favorite piece of equipment on the Caraway, and she said something so precisely cutting about its inability to produce anything that tasted like an actual food, rather than an approximation of a memory of food, and I laughed first, and then she laughed too, and she looked surprised by the sound she had made, and then she did not bother to be surprised about it anymore. She kept drawing. The sheets filled up, and I kept adding them to the safe, and she stopped pretending she did not notice me doing it. She also started teaching me Oron. It was not a formal decision. It started because she would occasionally slip into her own language when she was thinking through something complicated. And I would look at her, and she would repeat it in standard, and at some point I asked her to not repeat it. Just say it and let me try to understand. We spent 3 months on that. I was not fast. But I was persistent, which was a different thing, and Oren rewarded persistence because it was built for precision. Each sound chosen carefully to mean exactly one thing rather than 4 possible things depending on context. I found I liked that. I had spent 11 years in a trade world full of languages that meant whatever the person saying them needed them to mean at a given moment, and there was something restful about a language that did not do that. Sava said my accent was functional, but that I made the tonal registers sound like questions when they were not questions. I said that was a fair criticism of both my language skills and my general approach to uncertainty. She said, "You are different than you were." I said, 2 years will do that." She said, "Not time you." She tilted her head slightly. "You were very empty when you took me out of the pod. You were running on something older than hope. Now you are not doing that anymore." I thought about that for a while. "No," I agreed. "I am not." She said, "I know what changed. I did not say it to make you uncomfortable. I said it because I needed you to know that I see it." I looked at her. She said, very carefully, with the precision of someone who has chosen each word from a large and thoughtful vocabulary, "You gave me a reason. And I think maybe I gave you one too. And I think that is what she would have wanted." She, Elena. I had not expected to hear that framing from her. I had talked about Elena many times in those 2 years. In the way that you talk about someone who is gone but not absent, who is woven into the fabric of your daily life, even when the living version of them no longer fills the space. Sava had listened each time and asked questions and remembered the details and treated Elena not as a sad story but as a real person who had existed, and mattered and still did. But she had not used that framing before. The idea that this was something Elena would have wanted. "Why do you say that?" I asked. Sava said because she was a person who stayed for beautiful things. And I think staying for a child who needed someone to stay was exactly the kind of beautiful thing she would have recognized. I held very still. Then I said, "I think you are right." She nodded once and went back to her drawing, and I sat with what she had said for the rest of that afternoon. And it was not sad. That was the thing that surprised me. I had spent months carrying Elena's absence as a weight, as a pain, as something I was moving around rather than through. And this was not that. This was something lighter, something that felt, quietly, like the grief was still present, but it had changed its quality, the way a sound changes when it moves from an empty room into a room with people in it. It was still there. But it was not alone anymore. We found Adele Marsh on Peregrine 5 in the 14th month of the second year. The station was small and cold, and at the edge of the navigational charts, which Sava noted with a kind of irony that she had learned to use as a tool, the edge of the charts, where Oron things always ended up. Adele was a small, quick-eyed woman in her late 40s with short gray hair, and the kind of direct attention that doctors have when they have been doing something technical for a long time and have stopped having patience for anything that is not directly relevant. She examined the documentation, the xenolinguist's archive entries, the stasis records, her own prior research, and then she examined Sava with a thoroughness and a respect that I noticed, and that Sava, who was watching everything, noticed too. The activation process, Adele explained, was not surgical and not painful. It was a biochemical process, the same one that would have occurred naturally in Sava's development, had she not been in stasis during those years. It required a specific series of compounds administered over 3 days, which Adele had prepared in advance based on the research, and it would complete the biological maturation of the gland system that the archive was encoded in. At that point, the archive would become accessible to Sava consciously. She would be able to retrieve and process the information it contained. She would know her people, all of them, every name, every voice, every memory the bloodline had been built to carry. Sava asked one question before she agreed. "Will it hurt?" Adele said. "Not physically." She paused. "The information itself may be difficult." Sava said, "I know what is in there." She looked at me. "I would like Marcus to stay." I stayed. The 3 days were quiet. The compounds worked without visible drama. Sava ate and rested and talked with Adele about the biology, which interested her, and with me about small things, which was also a kind of steadiness. Owen had taken a 2-day contract at the station's trade office, partly for income and partly because he understood when his presence was not the thing a situation needed. On the 3rd morning, Sava woke before I did, and when I came to the common area she was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the surface, and her eyes open and very still. I made tea without saying anything. I set it in front of her. I sat down. We sat for a long time, then she said, "I know their names." Her voice was very even. The particular evenness I had learned to read not as emptiness but as the container for something very large. "All of them?" I asked. 412,681, she said. "I know each name. I know faces. I know a composer named Ela, who wrote music for Rainfall. I know a mathematician named Kale, who solved a proof that no one in the systems has solved since. I know a woman named Vara who kept bees on a station that no longer exists, because she believed in small growing things in difficult places." She stopped. "I know my mother's voice. I know what she said to me when she put me in the pod. I did not remember it consciously before. Now I do. I did not ask what the words were. That was hers." She sat with it for a while longer. Then she said, "I cried for 4 days. I need you to know that is what is going to happen." "I know," I said. She looked at me. "You do not need to do anything. You do not need to solve it." "I know that too," I said. She nodded. She cried for 4 days as she had said she would, not constantly in waves. The way grief works when it finally has permission to move. She ate when I brought food and she slept in pieces and sometimes she drew and sometimes she talked to Adele, who sat with her in the clinical way and the human way that a good doctor can do both at once. And I did the thing she had asked me to do, which was stay, not in the same room always, but close, present, available. Owen came back on the 2nd day, took one look at the situation and quietly took over all ship maintenance and meal preparation for the duration, without being asked. On the 5th day she came out of the crew cabin and sat at the table and looked at me with eyes that were tired but not broken. And she said, "Tell me what you want to do next." I said, "Whatever you need." She shook her head. "No, I have been the project for 2 years. Tell me what you want to do." I thought about it honestly. "I want to start rebuilding the Oran record," I said. "Not the archive, the living record. I want to find every fragment of documentation, every artifact, every piece of cultural material that survived the purge in the outer networks, in trade archives, in private collections. I want to build something that represents what your people were. Something visible. Something that says they existed and they mattered." Sava was very still. "That will take a long time," she said. "Yes," I said. "It will require going into networks and stations where the conglomerate has influence." "Yes," I said again. "It will require me to use the archive actively, to verify and authenticate what we find." "That is why you would need to be part of it," I said. "Not as the project, as the authority, as the person who knows." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Your wife." She mapped things that had not been mapped. She drew lines around what was found. "Yes," I said. "The map is not finished," Sava said quietly. I felt something move in my chest, warm and quiet and certain. "No," I said, "it is not." She put her hand on the table between us, palm up, not reaching, just open. I put mine next to it, not because we were anything to each other that had a name in any language I knew, not because the grief was finished or the danger was over, or the road ahead was clear. None of those things were true. The conglomerate had not stopped watching. The work ahead was enormous, and the resources we had were small, and there were days and months and probably years of difficulty between where we were and anything that looked like a finished thing. But she had survived 11 years sealed in a box while the world erased her people. And I had survived 7 months hollow enough that I put my wife's ring down on a scanner without caring what it cost. And somehow, the shape of those two losses had found each other in an auction room at the edge of the Dravari belt and made something that was not a replacement for what had been lost but was its own thing entirely. New, still forming, worth staying for. Elena had been right about the ring. She had always been right about the ring. Not the left hand, she always said. The left is for promises. The right is for choices. I wore it still, on the cord. I had not taken it off, but its meaning had grown. The scanner at Velhari Crossing had read it as an emotive artifact of the highest order, incalculable subjective value. It had read what Elena had put into it by choosing me every day for 3 years, and it had read what I had put into it by carrying it through every empty month after she was gone. And it had taken all of that accumulated weight and offered it forward, into an auction, into a pod, into a life. That was what love did, I thought, when it was the real kind. It did not stop, it did not run out. It went into things and it stayed there, warm as stone that has sat in sunlight, and it spoke for you when you no longer had the words. It moved through time and space and loss and found the places where it was most needed. And it said, this one does not get left behind. I did not know any of that when I put the ring on the scanner. I did not know what the ring was saying to the room. I did not know that in the Velhari rite there was a word for the particular quality of love that speaks through an object with such genuine force that it becomes a binding promise even without intent. I did not know that there was a 16-year-old girl in that pod who was the last vessel of 400,000 lives, and who would one day sit across from me on a salvage ship at the edge of charted space and say, "Tell me what you want to do next," as if the future were something that belonged to both of us. I did not know that grief could change its quality, the way a sound changes in a room with people in it. I did not know that staying close to a door for 4 days while someone cried was one of the most important things I would ever do. I did not know that the map Elena had started was still being drawn, and that the person who would help me finish it had been waiting in a cryogenic pod in grid sector 42, held in the cold and the dark, by the hope of a mother who had loved her child enough to believe the world would eventually send someone to find her. It sent me. I was not the most qualified person for that job. I was not the bravest or the wisest or the most prepared. I was just the one who was in that room when no one else would bid, carrying a ring full of love that I had not known how to put down. I did not know it then. I know it now, and knowing it does not fill the space that Elena left. Nothing fills that. But it gives the space a purpose, and purpose is something you can build a life around if you are willing to keep choosing it every day. On the right hand, the Caraway's engine hums beneath me as I write this. Owen is arguing with the navigation system in the next room about a course correction he disagrees with, which is a sound I have come to find genuinely comforting. Sava is at the table drawing patterns that carry names I am slowly learning to read, lines of a language that should have died in grid sector 42 12 years ago and did not, because her mother believed in small growing things in difficult places, and because a woman I loved believed that the things nobody wanted had the best stories, and because I walked into an auction room empty enough to be reckless, and came out with something that has slowly, quietly, certainly filled me back up. The stars are very close tonight, or they look that way from here. Elena